Good afternoon. My name is Mariam Gollari. I'm the Director of Extreme Events and Climate Risk at Geneva Association. I have the pleasure of chairing this session with very prominent speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Ottmar Edenhofer, from Climate Impact Research. He's the Deputy Director and Chief Economist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And his research explores the design of instruments for climate and energy policy. And he will be our first speaker. That would be followed by Dr. Erwan Michel Kerjan. Kerjan? Okay. Kerjan, Executive Director of Wharton Risk Center. He also is a professor at Wharton Business School and plays prominent roles in a number of boards, as well as he chairs the OECD Secretary General Board on Financial Management of Catastrophes. And then finally, we have Professor Georges Dion, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Risk Management at HEC Montreal. And he has been the editor of Journal of Risk and Insurance. One of his main achievements was to propose a new model for automobile insurance pricing that was implemented in Quebec. Thank you very much, and I invite you to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind words and for the invitation to Paris. Charlie Kolstad mentioned that there are basically three pillars for climate policy. One is adaptation, the other one mitigation, and the third one is risk moderation tools. I would like to talk now about the mitigation part. And what I intend to do is to present in the next 20 minutes the main insights from the IPCC. I had the pleasure to serve for the last 7 years as a co-chair of Working Group 3, and it's always nice to meet again the convening lead authors of the IPCC like Charlie, Christian, in a much more pleasant environment, not under such an enormous pressure compared to a normal IPCC meeting. Now, as you know, the IPCC has the mandate to present its result in a policy relevant, but not in a policy prescriptive way. With other words, you are always at risk to be very boring. So in the first 15 minutes, I tried to present the results of the IPCC in a very balanced way, and in the last 5 minutes, I take the opportunity here to behave as a free man and share with you my own opinions. Okay, talking about mitigation, I would like to do the following. First, I would like to start to explain where we are, and then I would like to explain what are the implications of some aspirational goals, and in the third part, I will say something on the distributional consequences. Now, where we are. So the most important insight from my point of view is to understand that emissions are rising, and they are even rising in the last decade with an increasing growth rate. That's important to understand, and within our report, we have tried to understand why we are on a business-as-usual pathway with rising emissions. And therefore, we try to understand basically the fundamental components of the CO2 emissions. What you can see here is these are the net growth rate, and we have decomposed the net growth rate into 4 components. The first component is GDP per capita, the second one is population, and the two others, carbon intensity and energy intensity. And what you can see here is that the GDP per capita becomes increasingly important as a driver of greenhouse gas emissions in the last decade, and population has decreased in its importance. There are two other components, the energy intensity, which is basically the decline of energy intensity, and vice versa, it's the improvement of energy efficiency. But this energy efficiency improvements have been always overcompensated by economic growth and by population growth. There's another component which I find quite interesting, and this is the carbon intensity component. And you can see that in the first 3 decades we have seen a declining carbon intensity. But now in the last decade we see an increasing carbon intensity. And unfortunately within the IPCC we have just the data until 2010, but in a few months from now you will see a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science where we explain in some detail what happened in the last 5 years, and the result is the following. The main reason why we see an increasing carbon intensity is due to the fact that we see the renaissance of coal in many parts of the world. It's not just the story of China, it's not just the story of India, it's almost in all the developing countries we see that coal basically is back, and this results in an increasing carbon intensity where we have seen in the last 3 decades a declining carbon intensity. And this is a quite interesting aspect here to understand because we are now not on a decarbonization pathway, even in the business as usual scenario, we are on a carbonization pathway. Now, this is where we are, and now I would like to highlight a little bit. So what are the discussions within the IPCC? What should be the aspirational goals? And as Bob Pindike has carried out, it is very hard to understand the damages, and the economists within the IPCC resisted to come up with numbers of the social costs of carbon as a recommendation to the policymakers. Instead of that, they have tried to categorize the impacts of climate change according to different risk categories, like the unique threatened systems, the increase of extreme weather events, and so on. What you can see here is this burning embers diagram is nothing more and nothing less than a kind of an expert elicitation. This is based on the insights and the evaluation of different experts. And what we can see here fundamentally is that in a business as usual scenario, humankind is at risk to increase the global mean temperature around 4 degrees. And you can see here that most of the risks are increasing, and the United Nations framework on climate change has asked us to explore, in particular, one important aspirational goal, which is the 2-degree target, and also some discuss the 1.5-degree target, which means that this 2-degree target is a kind of an application of a precautionary principle. So people felt, most experts felt, when we are able, would be able to limit the increase of global mean temperature to 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial level, so then severe risks and catastrophic events could be avoided. It was our task in the Working Group 3 to explore what are the implications, and here we came up with a few very nice insights which help us to understand the requirements of implications. So let's assume for a while that the 2-degree target is our aspirational goal. I will also show then the implications of other aspirational goals. So this has a strong implication because then we can translate the 2-degree target in the cumulative carbon budget which we can release into the atmosphere in order to be consistent with the 2-degree target. This means since industrialization we have roughly the potential, or we can release 3,000 gigatons. Since industrialization, we have already released 2,000, so the remaining budget are 1,000 gigatons CO2. And this budget can be translated in an emission reduction profile, and here we came up with the conclusion that between 40 to 70% is the emission reduction requirement by 2050. Now you might argue, so this is a very strange number because the range is quite large, between 40 to 70%, but this is due to the fact of technological uncertainty, in particular the uncertainty about the maturity of a very specific technology, which is called the carbon dioxide removal technologies. These technologies enable us, or would enable us, to remove emissions from the atmosphere, and they are necessary because of the ongoing renaissance of coal And if the carbon dioxide removal technology is available, so minus 40% would be a number, an emission reduction profile which is consistent with the 2-degree target. If this is not available or only to a limited amount, so then minus 70% by 2050 would be required. So this can be translated then in a kind of a time profile for emissions. So this is what you can see here. This is the business as usual scenario, and this will lead to an increase of global mean temperature around 4 degrees. And this is the emission reduction profile for 2 aspirational goals, one for the 2-degree target and the other one for the 3-degree target. And it is quite interesting to see that for a 3-degree target, a much larger carbon budget is available. However, and nevertheless, until the end of the century, we need almost a carbon-free economy. And compared to the 2-degree target, you can see that in most of the scenarios, we need the requirement of negative emissions. So this is an interesting component, and what you can see here is, and let me highlight the importance of carbon capture and storage and the use of bioenergy plus afforestation, because this is the most important part of the portfolio of the carbon dioxide removal technologies, which allows us to absorb emissions from the atmosphere. And here we have tried to explore what are the implications if these technologies cannot be implemented or cannot be applied. And what are the contributions then of the different sectors? What you can see here are the baseline scenarios for land use sector, for the electricity sector, the transport sector, the building sector, the industry sector, and the sector for non-CO2. So a 2-degree target would fundamentally require a decarbonization of the power sector. And the decarbonization of the power sector has been complemented in particular by carbon capture and storage because of the fact there is so much coal underground. And this is roughly a cost-effective contribution of the different sectors. Now let's assume that the carbon capture and storage technology is not available. This means then that the decarbonization of the power sector is less ambitious, but instead of an almost carbon-free or carbon-neutral land use sector, you need a lot of afforestation at a large scale. And this is quite important to understand, that if bioenergy and in particular carbon capture and storage is not available, so the land use sector and in particular afforestation has to play a much more important part. So we haven't said very clearly in our IPCC report that this comes with a price and with risks, because a lot of afforestation has a strong and a potential impact on biodiversity, on food security, and so on. And here we have tried to understand what are the risks of mitigation. It is important to understand that mitigation is not a riskless exercise at all. So this was, so to say, to explore what are the implications of the different sectors when specific and crucial technologies are not available. Then we have tried to understand what are the implications of delayed action. And here we tried to understand a little bit the relationship between the long run and the short term. As you know, John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run we are all dead, and therefore we thought that within the IPCC we should say something on the short run scale. Now what you can see here is, this is also scenarios for immediate action, which means basically at the end of this year the Paris would come up with a binding and an immediate implementable global deal, which is quite unlikely, but what we can see here is this translates then in an annual emission reduction profile, and this annual emission reduction profile can be translated into a requirement for low carbon energy. And you can see that this requires, this emission reduction profile of minus 3% per annum requires an upscaling of low carbon energy technologies, and this upscaling is almost unprecedented in economic history. So if there is a delay in mitigation, which basically means that we move until 2030 along the Cancun pledges, and the Cancun pledges are almost the pledges which are now on the table for the Paris meeting, which basically means delayed mitigation, then we inform the policymakers the 2-degree target is still feasible, but under a very strong additional requirement. After 2030, you need an annual emission reduction profile of -6%, and this will then be translated in an upscaling of low carbon technologies, which is even more ambitious compared to the case of immediate action, and which is also unprecedented in economic history. And this is something which is quite important for us to understand, because we want to inform the decision makers what are just the implications of their aspirational goals. Now, let me move on the costs. So here we have tried to calculate the mitigation costs. And we haven't calculated just the mitigation costs in the first best scenario, when immediate action is implemented and when all the technologies are available. In particular, what we have done here is we have tried to understand which kind of technology has the largest potential either to reduce the costs, or which technology has the largest potential to increase the costs when this technology is not available. And given the fact that about the enormous supply of fossil fuels underground, it's no surprise that carbon capture and storage is an incredible important technology. Or you can formulate it in another way and can say, if carbon capture and storage is not available, the mitigation costs will increase significantly. And the same is true with, in the case of bioenergy. If you have just a limited bioenergy potential, this has a potential to increase the costs. The reason why some nuclear phase out has not such a potential for the increase of the costs is due to the fact that it can relatively easily be substituted by renewables. So this is something, and fundamentally, in a nutshell, the storyline which we have formulated within the Working Group 3 report of IPCC. Now let me share with you a few personal thoughts. From my point of view, this graph characterizes an important part of the economics of climate change. What you can see here is that within the atmosphere, dependent on the aspirational goal, you can understand the atmosphere as a limiting disposal space for CO2. It's around 1,000 gigatons CO2. If you want to achieve a 3-degree target, it could be 1,800. But the most important thing is that the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere is much smaller than the resource and the reserves underground. And here what we have calculated, these are medians from the scenarios. So for a 2-degree target, with the option of carbon capture and storage, 70%, roughly 70% of coal has to remain underground, 35% of oil and 32% of gas. If CCS is not available, so then it's almost 90% of the coal, 60% of oil and gas, and these are just the mean numbers, the median numbers of the scenarios. But this is important to understand, and from my point of view, from an economic point of view, we should ask ourselves, what are the options how to deal with the economics of mitigation? And I see fundamentally 3 options. The first option is relying on a miracle. So being a Catholic, I believe in miracles, but I do not rely on them. But at least I can characterize what kind of miracle is needed. The miracle could be that tomorrow we wake up and we realize that the levelized costs of electricity, for example, for wind, is much lower than the extraction costs of coal. But this is not the case if you take into account the costs of fluctuation. Wind is much more expensive than coal. It is true that there is a lot of technological progress in the renewable energy sector, but nevertheless, it is very unlikely that we will see such a technological breakthrough that nobody has an incentive to use coal, gas, and oil anymore. The second option would be we compensate the owners of oil, coal, and gas. I leave it to your political judgment to what extent this is a feasible option. The third and important option is to put a price on carbon which is roughly consistent with the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, and it is open to debate what is exactly the limiting disposal space. Now, the problem with carbon pricing, and I think most economists would agree with that, the problem with carbon pricing is that we need it at an international scale, and we would need fundamentally after Paris a global carbon price. There are a few interesting proposals, but here I would like to highlight just two additional thoughts. I do not deny the enormous importance of a global carbon price, but I would like to highlight an important aspect here. And the important aspect is we should think about, are there any important motivations for real-world finance ministers to put a price on carbon even if they do not believe in climate change? In other words, from my point of view, we should not just to continue the debate about long-term aspirational goals. Instead, we should think more about the effective entry points in a climate policy. And from my point of view, there are a few reasons for an effective entry point in the short term. The one is that finance ministers could have a strong incentive even for unilateral carbon pricing, because on the one hand, carbon pricing is much better than taxing capital or labor, and the revenues of the carbon taxes could be used for infrastructure investments. Infrastructure investments in many countries which would allow people to alleviate poverty, for example. Here we have done a calculation. So what are the impacts of carbon revenues around 10 euros per ton CO2 to provide people a universal access to electricity, to water, to sanitation, to information technologies and roads. And it turns out that even in most African countries, such a carbon price could finance this infrastructure investments and could promote the Sustainable Development Goals. Another important short-term entry point for climate policy could be the co-benefits of the increasing local air pollution, which might be a strong motivation, for example, for the Chinese government to take action immediately. It seems to me this is an important aspect, a very practical aspect to find this short-term entry point, because from my point of view, it is very clear that irrespective of the precise goal we would like to achieve, the 2-degree target or the 3-degree target, all these targets require a fundamental departure from the business-as-usual scenario. And we are not on track. And what we can see now is that the renaissance of coal, from my point of view, is a real risk, and we have to take this risk into account, in particular in the next few years. Again, unilateral carbon pricing, using the revenues in a reasonable way, either to reduce other taxes or to finance a strategic infrastructure investment in the developing countries or improve the local air pollution, could be a reasonable starting point. And my last thought is the following. When we now talk in Paris about an agreement, so here we are at risk that the pledges are formulated in a way which are totally inaccessible to normal people and even to the finance ministers. So why not, instead of coming up with such strange pledges, reducing emissions compared to a theoretical business-as-usual scenario, why not formulating policy packages and in particular carbon prices in order to find this effective entry point? So now these are my final thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention.
I prefer your second part. Your first. Are you still awake? You're good? I know the lunchtime, after lunch presentation time is always difficult. First of all, before I start, I would like to recognize Delhi's leadership for funding the SCOR Foundation for Science. I've been privileged to serve on the board along with George and John Tyrrell and a few other people, and I think what you've done is pretty spectacular. That's just the beginning of an interesting journey, I think, but the quality of the people here today is pretty remarkable, and yesterday, of course. I'm going to depart from most of what you've heard so far because my task was a little bit different than the one of others, was to take everything you've heard and to move from the mitigation side of the equation to what Charlie and the second panel this afternoon talked about, the adaptation side of the equation. And that's a good link to what you just described in the sense that we can keep talking about what should be done. We can do that for 20 years. That's fantastic. Intellectually speaking, that's very stimulating. The challenge that's not the way the world works. I'm a little bit more optimistic about Paris than maybe Jean and other people here. Not that I expect a worldwide agreement. There will be a second miracle, which will make you a saint. And you need two miracles to become a saint. If you're not Catholic, that's a learning experience here. I think what's going to happen, what could happen, at least we're working pretty closely between the White House, the president, and the Chinese, is to see whether the US and China could come up with something. Again, we're not talking about 200 countries agreeing with each other here. We're talking about two. And for many reasons, political reasons, stress on the system we've seen. You mentioned a few of them. I mentioned many of them on the adaptation side in a minute. There is an interest and maybe a desire to move. So if Paris can just do that, I think that would be the first miracle, half of it at least. So we'll see what happens. If you're just waiting for something to happen in life, nothing happens. So unless you take leadership and actually do something about it, maybe we'll have a chance. So let me briefly move to the talk here, which is very much a question about what the insurance industry can do. We've talked a lot about science, and I'll talk a little bit about science here as well. Fundamentally, if you're part of the insurance and reinsurance industry, you hear all of that and you ask yourself, what does that mean for us? What can we do about it? How the world of insurance will look like in about 20 years, a world that has been fairly stable in the past 200 years. So that's what I would like to say, and my title basically tells you where I stand. I'm a big believer in the power of the private market, generally speaking, and I'm an even bigger believer on the power of insurance as a market incentive tool and a signal of exposure. Still, I have, thanks Charlie for the laser, I have an interrogation mark here. The question is whether the insurance and reinsurance will actually come up to the leadership table. We've seen many pilots here and there. I think we need more pilots to move the needle. So that's why I call that role and responsibilities of the largest industry in the world. If you think about the private sector, well, let's start with the largest insurance industry, largest industry in the world. Just briefly, just to position the debate about climate in a risk management space. You know, if you breathe and sleep about climate models, you don't necessarily think about all the other risks out there. If you're an insurance or reinsurance company, climate risk is one of many risks you have to be thinking about. For the past 10 years, our team at Wharton, along with Zurich and Marsh McLennan, have put together what's called the Global Risk Report. We release a report every year about 2 weeks before Davos, and then we discuss the result of the report at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Don't try to read my next slide. I'm just going to make a point, okay? I know you're going to try to read it, but basically, we look at 20 to 30, 40 risks. We do a perception survey. That would be something we can talk about it. What has been interesting about many global risks around the world, climate change is now clearly one of the top among many, many other different types of risks for many people outside the climate discussion here. And obviously, other risks such as water crises, weather events are interdependent here as well. Why is that important? If you want to move the needle of policymakers, you better know what's happening in Davos, because that's one of the places where people talk about things. Sometimes we do things as well. It's supposed to be a joke, especially in France, but that's okay. I'm going to move on. But that's interesting, an interesting barometer I mean here. So that graph, which I stole from Peter Hopper's shop at Munich, I'm not going to go over many slides you have seen about the growing cost of disasters. I mean, I assume many of you have seen that. The only data point I'm going to use is that one, which is very simple. if you look at the past 30, 35 years, the number of what Munich calls the major weather event, depending on where you're looking at, multiplied by about 2.5. If you're an insurance company, that's an issue for you. What do you do about it? Whether it's driven by climate, high population in high-risk areas, more asset in exposed areas. Almost, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, it does matter, but climate is not the main driver, so you need to understand what your exposure look like. So I have 3 points I would like to make. Are you still sleeping, or you good? You back? Okay. That's the way I wake up my MBA students. So on the one hand, the insurance industry has clearly played its role. I think over the years, they have been paying a bunch of money after major disaster, really participating into the economic recovery. The question is not clear whether the insurance industry will be capable of doing that alone in the future. The point I'm going to make, which is rarely made, is I'm not sure the insurance industry will be let to do it alone anymore. So just to wake you up a little bit, I would like, do you have a piece of paper? I would like each one of you to take a pen and a piece of paper. If you don't have one, you can do that in your brain. And imagine you're the CEO of a large, not necessarily a large, let's say a reinsurance company. Could be a large one, SCOR, Munich. So you've just been appointed the CEO of that company. And on the left part of your paper, I would like you to mention who you believe are your top 3 competitors today. So who are your top 3 competitors today as a reinsurance company? I'm testing the climate scientists in the room, the same way they tested the insurance people in the room. So that's the top 3. Denise, are you doing it, or you know it? And the right side, I would like you to list who you believe will be your top 3 competitors in the next 5 to 7 years. Okay, who wants to just take a few people? Give me names.
The same.
The same? Google? Now or in the future? Okay, good one. Who else? Capital markets, hedge funds are coming. Okay, who else? Munich should be on your top, by the way. I mean, I don't want to say anything, but you know, it's still like the largest one. Who else? Yeah? Good. The World Bank? Okay. The point I'm going to make here, I'm going to skip that, is about knowing your competitors, more generally speaking, from a public policy perspective. That was the task we were assigned for this panel. The big question is who's going to pay for these disasters, both in OECD and non-OECD countries? To me, it's a more fundamental question than what the climate will look like in 10 years for the insurance industry. And I'm a big climate scientist believer. The point I'm making here is that there have been a wave of change in many countries we're just starting to see that will be much more impactful to the insurance and reinsurance industry than what we believe it is today. And you mentioned a good names that are coming up in my mind. So to illustrate that, I'll come back to Google in a few minutes. Working with them, I can say a few things and other things I cannot say, but that will be interesting, the impact on Google on CAT modeling firms, for instance. So I'm going to take, as an illustration, the point I'm going to make is your bigger competitors actually the very governments where you do business in, for many political reasons. One of them is if you see more and more climate disasters happening over a very short period of time, you have a massive political issue if the president or you run the country, whatever country you're talking about. So as the sake of an illustration, I have 3 points. The first point will take another 5 or 6 minutes, and the last 2 points I'll be pretty brief on it. For sake of example, I'm going to take the largest economy in the world, or even though it could be China these days, depending on how you count. I'm going to take the United States of America, by far the largest insurance market in the world, and for most people, the country that believe is the most pro-market economy you can think about. Do you believe the US is a pro-market economy? Are you back to sleep? Compared to France. Thank you. So used to be, it's not anymore, that's the point I'm going to make. I'm going to look at a few lines of business for insurance companies and ask a very simple question. Who is the largest provider of insurance today in the US? The first one, and most of that comes from a book that a colleague of mine, Howard Conrad, and I published a few years ago from MIT Press called At War with the Weather. If you don't have the time to read the book, there is a trailer, as in movies, 2-minute summary of the book. I'm going to skip that. What happened, basically, the story goes as follows. Hurricane Katrina happened. Hurricane Katrina was a very devastating disaster. We're going to celebrate the 10th anniversary in the next few weeks. But that was not just Katrina, actually. 7 major hurricanes hit landfall within a 15-month period. It's never happened before. That was a big, big political issue in the US, cost a lot of money. Enough political issue that the Council of Economic Advisors, which produced the economic report of the president, arguably one of the most important economic report of any administration, devoted in an entire chapter along with immigration, productivity growth to catastrophic risk insurance. Started to make insurance a little bit more sexy in Washington. At the same time, basically what happened is what you expect from a pro-market economy. The price of insurance in the state of Florida, for instance, started to increase radically, mainly due to the fact that reinsurers had to increase their cost, mainly driven by the higher cost of capital. We know that, we teach that. What we didn't see coming in Florida is what happened next. What happened next, the state regulator, pressured by the governor, started to block any premium increase in Florida, saying, you insurance companies, I don't allow you to increase your premium by more than X. Starting to move away from a pro-market economy. Very quickly, that's what you would expect, many insurance companies actually left the state of Florida. The largest insurance provider for residential wind coverage today is Citizens, which is a state-run company, about 35% of the market. The state of Florida. This is America. Even the French wouldn't do that. I'm like, okay. Then I moved to flood insurance. I've published extensively of flood insurance. I'm going to summarize that in one on the public policy side. One slide. The National Flood Insurance Program, which is a government program in the US, provide a fairly subsidized rate for many people in the US for residential flood insurance. Well, after Katrina, after Ike in Texas, after Sandy in 2012, basically the program is running a $24 billion deficit. Is that good? Is that bad? No, it's not good. I mean, all the insurance people here. $24 billion deficit, that become a very big political issue. We work with 2 great senators, Judy Bigger from Illinois and Chicago, and Maxine Waters from California, and a group of us, many of us actually, maybe 50 people work with them, and we passed what is known in the US as a bigger water legislation, basically moving the National Flood Insurance Program to a risk-based program. We celebrated that. We thought that was a good idea. If the insurance is rightly priced, that will give a signal of the exposure to people living in high-risk area. Maybe they will not move to the coast. Maybe they will mitigate, reduce their exposure. All of that was fantastic. Second thing we didn't see coming, again, political reaction. Many people started to write to their senators and representatives saying, I don't want that increase in my insurance premium. This is totally unfair. Unfair. Okay? Washington being Washington. 2 years later, the same Maxine Waters issued a new legislation that passed the Congress and was signed by the president called the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. Nothing to do with the Healthcare Act. I'm not going there. It's called the Affordability Act, basically crossing the previous legislation. Larger insurance provider of residential flood insurance in America, the federal government. And finally, 2 points here. You get the point, I think. I mean, if you're asking the real competition, that's actually your very government here. And it's not just that the government is playing a more active role in the insurance space. And by the way, in Florida, there is a state-run reinsurance organization called the Florida Hurricane Cat Fund that's mainly led by the state as well. On the next graph, that's a paper that Howard and I published in Science a few years ago, looking at disaster relief. And I'm going to show you the evolution over the past 60 years in America of the number of presidential disaster declaration. Basically, a disaster happened, the president is asked by the governor of the state to declare the state of emergency. Okay? 1950s, 2011. Democrats, Republican, doesn't really matter. You have a few peaks here, presidential election year. Okay, you got the point. After the science article, the good thing with science is it tends to be pretty short, so people in Congress actually read it. And so I was asked to testify before the US Senate Banking Committee on that very topic, and one thing they asked me, it took me about a year to get the data, is could you come up with a clear understanding on who paid what after disaster? There is no accounting in the US about who pays what after disaster, which is somewhat strange. But working with many people, we basically put that together. Hurricane Diane, 1955, about 6% was paid by American taxpayers. Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Katrina, 50%. Right here, you can debate whether it's still a pro-market economy when 50% of the cost of the disaster, just talking direct economic cost, is paid by the taxpayers ex post. Ike, Sandy. This is a very popular graph in Congress because it's simple, it's color-coded, red is bad, green is good. Very simple, you know. Yeah, it's recorded, I should be careful. Well, that's where we are now. So we're now working with the administration, the insurance industry, stakeholders, trying to revert that. So the insurance industry in the US, at least on the residential side, has been fighting a pie that's diminishing again and again and again and again in a heavy level, with a heavy level of regulation. In the US, you have basically 51 levels of regulation, one for each state and the federal level. So it's a nightmare in terms of doing business there. I'm going to skip that as well. So coming back to your true competitors, and you can do that in other, many people try to go to China. Well, the Chinese government is still the largest provider of compensation after disasters. That may change in the future. But the two big competitors, I think, for the insurance industry, and I truly believe that, on the technology side, Google and Facebook. Like what? Facebook? Are you on Facebook? You want to be a friend? Facebook is now looking for revenue source. And Facebook has an amazing clientele. People trust Facebook. The level of trust in the insurance industry in general is a little bit lower than in Facebook. And we're working on that. If Facebook decides to sell insurance tomorrow, there are many reasons why they may not do that. There are very legal reasons why it may be difficult to do that. But trust me, that's going to be big very quickly. Google's the same thing. Google is working with IBM and NASA now to develop an open source. We'll see how open it is. A flood elevation model. Wow. Elevation. That's the big thing for flood. If they do that, that will change the name of the game, I think, in many parts of the world. And then the government. Okay, you can look at your list and see whether you're right. Very briefly, here I have about 6-7 minutes to go. So the first point is know your competition. Who's going to pay for these disasters? More and more often, people are going to ask their own government to bail them out. And because they've been doing that again and again and again, it's very hard for a new president, a new administration, not to give as much money as a previous administration has given. Very hard politically to do. So the second point is, well, the only way you can move the barrier of insurability is by lowering the exposure. It's insurance 101. You reduce the exposure, the risk. So here I would like briefly to bring what many people have talked about in the past day and a half, which is, can we actually do the full-fledged analysis at a local level, recognizing very big level of uncertainty, of a cost-benefit analysis of a portfolio of risk reduction measures, not greenhouse gas emission, I'm talking catastrophic risk reduction exposure at the city level. So we've tried that. There are great things about the paper. There are other things that we could do better. Actually, we were thinking about doing it, and the call came from the office of Michael Bloomberg in New York when he was the mayor of New York, before Hurricane Sandy, which is pretty remarkable. Typically, elected officials react to a disaster, and then they call the scientists for help. They actually called the Dutch team in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, University of Amsterdam. The Dutch people know a few things about flood protection. If you've been there, you know. And I love that picture of New York City. If you don't think New York has a flood issue, that picture should convince you otherwise. New York, unless you come here, which is higher, Wall Street has a slight flood issue. So if you think sea level rise, storm surge, and alike, that's a big issue, as we've seen during Hurricane Sandy, which was not even a hurricane when it hit landfall. Sandy was a flood event. So what we've done basically is to think about who could help us do the full-fledged analysis from hurricane simulation to storm surge, which is not very well understood today, to actually doing what cat modeling companies do, which is to do the vulnerability assessment, then to run the entire cost-benefit analysis for a menu of options, and then to ask the tough policy question, which is who's going to pay for that. Recognize on each one of these steps you have massive uncertainty at all the levels that Jeff mentioned before, but that uncertainty is not an excuse for inaction. So I'm not going to show you the full thing, but if you want to read that, there was another paper we published last year in Science with the team at the University of Amsterdam, Carrie Emanuel at MIT, and Ling Lin, who is at Princeton now. She did her PhD on storm surge simulation under Carrie. And that was basically what we're trying to do here. Long story short, we send that to the editor of Science saying, make sure you find the toughest referees you can find, because we want that to be proof of concept for other cities to do it. So we went through 12 reviews. I'm saying that for my peers. You know, after 3 reviews, you're tired. After 12, you wonder whether it would be one day would be published. And basically, that was published. And basically, what we've done is to look around many of the. I'm going to go through very quickly. Elevation of some of the buildings, some replenishment of the beaches here, a few levees, massive levees right here, which is great from an economic perspective, from an environmental perspective, that's a disaster, and from a political perspective, that's complicated, because if you prevent the water to come here, you protect Wall Street, fantastic. Where is the water going? New Jersey. Someone has to get the water. So you have political issues here. Anyhow, long story short, and then we looked at hybrid solutions of elevating some of the critical infrastructure. We got the entire stock database from New York. I mean, that's a lot of work behind all of that. You have 3 pages in Science and 62 pages of online material if you want to read that. And bottom line, we run the thing, and then what we find is, Mr. Mayor, don't do anything now. Trust me, that's not what we were expecting. The level of risk for New York is too low for New York to invest in protection measures right now. Now, if you look at extreme climate scenario like rapid ice melting, now you start talking about potentially investing with a good return investment for the city of New York. But again, we spend a lot of time with both the mayor and his team explaining the results, so they understand that there is no way someone is going to come with a point estimate. There are a lot of uncertainty. You heard a lot about that today. I think the big issue for us as scientists is to make sure that, 1, we recognize that, and 2, we are as transparent, going back to Bob's point, as possible, saying, well, we don't know for sure, but there are uncertainty along the line of the entire analysis here. Mr. Mayor, depending on what you want to do, you need between $6 and $20 billion. That was the answer. Then he moved to London. Point number 3, 2 slides here because I just have 1 minute. Well, the big question in New York was, well, and that's true, we are now working with the Rockefeller Foundation, as been mentioned before. What has happened in New York could be replicated, we hope, in other big mega cities near the coast. With local team, you have to understand the specificity of the cities, but the methodology, I think, is solid. Come back to my last point, which is, in all of that, what can the insurance industry do? And I'm always surprised when I'm invited or when I go to insurance and climate discussion. I mean, this event was very high level. Typically, in terms of quality of the intervention, typically what you hear is that climate means climate disasters for the insurance industry. That's an underwriting issue. Always, 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 always. I'm like, okay, not only. So I think I call that the silence power of insurance. Unless you're in the insurance industry, you may know the answer, or you should at least. Do you know how much asset under management the insurance industry has today? 30 trillion. Sound right? How many zeros in trillion? Yeah, that's about right. When I ask people who are not in that industry, they don't have a clue. I mean, they don't even think about it. You're Munich, so you think about these issues a lot. That's about 30 trillion and growing. It's a recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers. By 2020, about $35 trillion in assets, which make the insurance and reinsurance companies the second largest institutional investors, right below pension funds. The way they are going to invest that money, or could invest that money, will change the name of the game, I think, or could change the name of the game on adaptation to climate disasters. So you're basically worrying on the underwriting side of the equation, and you see the asset management side to actually invest in resilience improving investment. So just, I'm almost done here, but for many people, 35 million is a little bit opaque. So I was speaking 2 weeks ago here in Paris at another event, and I decided to make it simple. Every French flag is how much France spend every year. We're spending more than we're getting, by the way. So you can go on and on and on, but the point I'm going to make is all the discussion about negotiation at COP 19, 18, 20, 21, 22 next year in Morocco is always about what the government can do, and the role of the private sector is at best partially addressed. Why the financial power is not in governments anymore. Most of the governments are in massive deficit. Financial power in the private sector. The question is, how do you work with the private sector, not to tax that money, but to make that money work much better here? We talk about green bonds. Great. Great. I'm on the advisory board of AXA. AXA just announced 2 or 3 weeks ago that AXA will triple its investment in green bonds, which makes AXA the largest investors in green bonds today. Great, $36 billion. It's small. My proposal, and my last slide, George is asking whether I'm going to be done now, is to turn the entire discussion upside down and to think about resiliency investment opportunity. Okay. And the point is basically, in the next 5 to 10 years, we know for sure there is no uncertainty here. Trillions of euros of investment will have to be made to maintain, upgrade, and build new infrastructure. By the way, in America, 85% of infrastructures is owned or operated by the private sector, contrary to what people think, not the public sector. Massive investment. The question, can you make sure that these investments in the future are climate proof? If we can certify some of these investments, now you can think about resiliency bond, much bigger nominal on the bond that you have on the green bonds. And investors could actually label that, as they are doing now with green bonds, to some extent, as socially improving investment. CSR, I'm speaking in front of you, Gregory, here, becoming a bigger issue, bigger demand from customers. All of that can only happen under one condition, and my last point here, if the regulators, international regulators, start looking at some of these investment by treating long-term investment in a much more favorable way than they're doing now. Right now, your best interest is to invest in short-term investment. If you want to unlock that massive asset under management, and I'm thinking not only the insurance industry, but BlackRock, Vanguard, and others, it's not going to happen. But it's possible to happen. The money is here. It has to be redirected the right way. Thank you.
Good afternoon. 2 months ago, I received an email telling that Denis Kessler asked you to answer to this question in 2 months in Paris at a conference. So I said yes, I had not the choice. But my problem was that I don't do research on climate risk. So I start to read on that. I learn a lot of things. So what I will present this afternoon is a kind of description of the situation, okay, that I saw. And probably the round table after will be able to answer to the question. So, natural hazard cause natural disaster. Here we don't have problem with causality, I think. Natural disaster cause fatalities, and 2 million, probably much more since 1980 around the world, and only 5% of them in high-income countries like Europe and North America. 70 million people are affected each year by climate risk. And we have about, in 2014, we had 12,000 deaths, but this is much less than 80,000 since 1980 on average. To save life now, the most effective policies is to have warning system. It works, but all countries do not have access to this. So natural disaster affects social welfare by causing economic consequences. And economic consequences are often more severe than immediate losses related to property damage, business interruption, and fatalities. We have, in the long run, loss of production, lower productivity, higher unemployment, lower future consumption, lower taxes. These losses go beyond to insurance and reinsurance, and I will show you that, in fact, the insurance industry is not very involved in that for the moment. So how the insurance industry can contribute. I will use the definition of natural disaster that we have in the literature. This is about $50 million death or insured loss of about 25 million. So we already see the 50%. Okay. So usually in the US, there is no more than 50% of the insurance implied in the losses. Okay. We can define also using injured people, okay? Fatalities. Recently we had in Texas, Oklahoma, 30 deaths. So it was a natural disaster. Now, how can we define the resilience? Okay. So I found a very good study in the World Bank who was presented last year in a conference organized by banks on the same subject. Okay? And the first definition is macroeconomic resilience. Okay? Suppose we have a big event that costs delta car in assets. We will define macroeconomic resilience as the variation of the consumption related to this loss of assets. Okay. So in a resilient economy, delta C should be low for a given delta car. Now, we can also think about macroeconomic resilience, okay, which is more related to people because this is the welfare loss, okay, for a given variation of delta C. Okay. And delta car can be reduced by reducing global warming. It is not so true now because of yesterday. We can reduce also delta C by increasing resilience. We can reduce delta W by increasing resilience. So what instrument do we have? We have reinsurance, insurance-linked securities, which are very important now, government support, public and private insurance, savings, prevention, risk management. And prevention is a big issue in this market, and there is not really incentive for prevention. We observe a lot of moral hazard problem. So let me present a very simple framework and then see what insurance is doing in that. Suppose we have a big event with a loss of assets of delta car. Okay? If we want to compute the variation of consumption that is related to delta car, we have to take into account of the reconstruction time. We have to take account of the productivity of capital in a given country and different externalities related to the event. So we can write delta C as a function of delta K, and usually gamma, the parameter, is greater than 1. So delta C is the reduction of future consumption. This is a long-term effect, okay? And we can define the macroeconomic resilience as gamma, in fact. 1 over gamma is the macroeconomic resilience, I'm sorry. So in a very efficient country, gamma is close to 1, and the variation of consumption will be about the variation of assets. But the problem is that this is not welfare. Okay, this is only variation of consumption. Now, if you want to discuss variation of welfare for the individual, we can go to the macroeconomic resilience and have a similar definition. Okay, and to be more specific, let us define C, okay, the consumption of the country, as the consumption, the average consumption of poor individuals times the number of poor individuals, and the average consumption of rich individuals times the number of rich individuals. So we can decompose the variation of welfare as a long-term effect, which is kappa here, and a short-term effect. Let us suppose for a moment that we are in a poor country, very poor country. So the number here is about 0. Okay? This means that total consumption is NP times CP, okay? And the link between consumption and welfare is a utility function, as usual, okay? And in a poor country, this effect is big because the marginal utility of consumption of poor is very high in general. Okay? Moreover, we can add to variation of the welfare the instantaneous impact of this type of event, okay, like death, injuries, health, property losses. And usually in poor countries, for poor people, PSI, okay, which is the insurance coverage or the government support, is very low. Okay? So in poor countries, the variation of W is very high for a given delta C. This means that poor countries do not have high resilience about climate risk. We can do the converse with the rich countries. Here, the marginal utility will be a little bit lower, but the insurance coverage is higher and the government support is higher, as we saw. So we can summarize the variation of welfare, okay, as starting from a variation of assets, okay, as an inverse function of the resilience, the two types of resilience. And insurance can collaborate to this form of resilience of the economy by increasing the macroeconomic resilience, okay, by reducing the variation of consumption for a given event, and it can increase the macroeconomic resilience by increased coverage for the instantaneous losses and consumption. Now, this is theory. Okay. Where do we stand now? In the following analysis, I will present statistics. I don't have a model, okay? No, so I have statistics. And what we learn from these statistics, okay, particularly in the US, this is the best I found, is that we have low insurance penetration in climate risk. Okay, this is the first problem. Usually, for many years, people said this is because of low insurance demand. Okay, people underestimate the risk. Okay, they have a bias thing. The problem is that the insurance industry is not prepared for that. Okay, and I will describe a report for the NAIC, recent report, 2014, and you will be surprised by the result of this report. Now, what I also observe, okay, may be discussed later, is I found a potential overcapacity in the reinsurance industry, okay, for many factors. First, there is low demand by the insurance company because they are not in the market, in fact, so they don't need the insurance we think they should need. there is larger concentration in the insurance industry, and this is related to climate risk, as we will see, okay? And there is strong regulation of capital, okay? The regulator asks more and more capital in the reinsurance industry because they think there is some systemic risk. So what are the major issues related to this? First, population are concentrated in high-risk area, okay? So they like to be where the risk is, because probably this is the most beautiful places and things like that, okay? By this, what we observe is an increase in the frequency and more particularly on the conditional losses of climate risk since 1970. Okay. There is a low demand, and this is a study by the RAND Corporation. Of course, individuals underestimate, okay, they don't know that risk. They are not expert. There is a bias of anticipated net loss estimation because they think anyway the government will come, okay? And as we will see, the wealth inequality affect insurance demand, okay? And we observe higher and higher wealth inequality in many countries. So, as an example, flood insurance is subsidized since 1968 in the US, and the demand remains low because of even of that. Another issue is for the insurance industry is that this risk, okay, fluctuates radically. This is not a usual trend, okay? There is a lot of fluctuation, okay? So this is very risky for the insurance industry, and the insurance industry must use a risk premium in insurance pricing, okay? So the price is usually high, okay? I would come back on the supply side, okay? There is another problem, which is, I didn't know really that problem, but it was discussed yesterday, and this is an important one. There is a mismatch between what we ask for prevention, investment in prevention, and insurance contracting, okay? And if I will have a PhD student willing to work on that, I will ask him to redesign the insurance contracting for climate risk, okay? Because we ask people to, or society or cities to invest for 10 and 15 years a project, okay, which is very costly, which will make some prevention for the next 15 years, but the insurance will offer only 1 year contract, okay? So there is no commitment by the insurance industry about this investment, okay? And I think we should, if we want to reduce the moral hazard problem and have an incentive to invest, we should reverse that, and there should have more commitment by the insurance industry on long-term contract for climate risk. Of course, for the reinsurance industry, this is very complicated because the insurance schemes vary a lot across countries. We have voluntary regime, we have index-based regime, we have regime that are related to insurance regime to mortgage or other loan, and we have private, public, and mixed type of insurance. The good news is the insurance-linked securities. This is a growing market. This is a very important market, and it represents now 40% of the climate risk coverage, okay? This is very important, and I will come back on this. What is the advantage of this type of coverage? It can lower the cost of risk transfer in hard reinsurance market, okay? Help to maintain insurance capacity, okay, and reinsurance capacity, offer multi-year protection, usually cat bonds are for 3 or 5 years. They are more and more free of collateralization problem, okay? So there is full collateralization, except if you did buy cat bonds from Lehman, okay? And investor, okay, for the investor, this is a good investment because this risk is usually not correlated with the other market liquidity and credit risk, okay? So this is a way to diversify your portfolio, okay? But even if they are efficient, okay, and well used by reinsurance industry, this product cannot solve the insurance demand problem and the insurance penetration problem. We need, of course, the government in that market. We don't know how. There are many possible solutions. We need the government because there are externalities, and usually prevention is a public good. Okay. The government can reduce adverse selection. Okay. The government can increase diversification by compulsory insurance. But the problem with the government is that it creates a big moral hazard problem. We have this problem in France and in the US. The government are present, but they don't design optimal contracting. Okay? So they must improve their type of contracting also. So I said that the insurance industry is not ready. I was very surprised to obtain this report, and this is a serious report. This is a report from a survey done by the NAIC, which is the regulator. Okay. More than 30 insurance companies participate to this. Okay. And most of the insurers reported profound lack of preparation in addressing climate-related risk. This is in 1914. This is in the US. Okay. P&C insurers are more involved. Health insurers have not started. Health insurers also have not started. Okay. And only about 10% of the P&C have issued public climate risk management statements. Okay. 50% have started to have positive step in climate change modeling and analytics, but they have started. 31%, only 31% use climate risk governance practices. Only 28% use enterprise risk management practice with climate risk. Only 12% have stakeholder engagement with climate risk. So I will give you some statistics and then conclude, because the statistics are important. 88% of the catastrophic events are weather-related, so this is an important problem, okay, that we are facing here during these 2 days. Okay. 40% of the loss occur in Asia, okay, since 1980, but 64% of the coverage is in North America. In the US, I took one particular risk. We see a trend. Okay, of course, there is a trend, but what we observe is that there is high fluctuation, very high fluctuation. What observe the last 2 years of data, this is below average, much below average. Okay, so this is very difficult for the insurance company to set the premiums, okay, and for the reinsurance industry to reinsure, because we cannot use the loss experience of the last 2 years, for example. We need very high risk management insurance pricing model. Okay. The other data is related to the insurance coverage. As you can see, insurance coverage is in the United States is less than 50%. Okay. Here you have Katrina. Okay. Here you have New York. Okay. This is not only the event, but this is the year. And here you have Ike. Okay. All of them had partial insurance. Katrina killed more than 1,000 people, and only 41 victims had access to insurance. Okay. Hurricane Ike, 17.6 billion of insurance losses, and as said before, the national program lose 30 billion with only these 2 events. Okay, so this is a big risk. This is a big risk. Hurricane in New York City, total loss of 50 billion. I think it is probably higher than that. And as I said, Oklahoma and Texas recent tornadoes kill more than 30 people. We are more lucky in Canada, okay? We are more lucky with climate risk in Canada. The higher event was in 2013, 6 billion, and again, the insurance company lost 3 billion. This is the evolution of insurance coverage over time around the world, okay? So here we have about the same event, but here you have the Tokyo here, okay? And the Thailand, okay? There were two big events during that year. So it costs more than 350 billion of loss. But as you can see, the increase, there is an increasing curve with a slope. But if you observe the slope of insurance coverage, you observe that the slope is much lower than the slope of economic losses. So there is big welfare losses around the world. If we compare with the GDP, some year it go up to 1% of the GDP. So this is very big numbers. Okay. If we compare with stock market capitalization, some year this is about 1%. If we compare with debt securities, again, this is close to 1%. Okay. This is bad news, but this is also good news. This means that the financial market can still be involved in that, okay? Because the losses represent less than 1%. We can discuss this in the other way, okay? We can ask even higher participation from bond investor and stock investors. It was mentioned several times. The severity is higher, okay? Over 2014, the severity losses represent 45, the more severe, 45 of total losses, while it was only 30% before. So this is for research again. We have compute the correlation between merger and acquisition in the insurance industry and the insurance losses. With a lag of 1 year, there is a correlation of 33%. This is not a causality again, but this is what we observe. Because after big events, okay, some insurance companies become weak, and there is more and more merger and acquisition. Okay, so there is big concentration of the market over the recent year. Bad news for the reinsurance companies, because they are bigger and bigger. Okay, so we do more inside reinsurance. Okay, we do more inside reinsurance, and we can see that outside reinsurance is even decreasing. Okay, for the US. So I said that there is over capacity. Okay, the capital in the reinsurance industry is over than $500 billion. Okay, but the insurance, the losses, for example, in 2008 was 130 billion and only 44 billion insured. Okay, and total climate risk in 2011 was much bigger, 35 and 75. This is total loss. Okay, and the capital was there for the total loss, but only 125 billion were insured. This is the growth of the alternative market. It is doing well, and what is interesting is that the collateral coverage is becoming more and more significant, which is good news. Okay, but the reinsurance industry remains very important. Okay, even if those alternative coverage increase. And the financial crisis did create a little bit of difficulties for the industry, but it is now at the level of before. Okay. Those who invest in that are institutional investor, catastrophe fund. Okay, there is no very many individuals in that. Okay, so the main conclusion from this statistics is that reinsurance capital is very high. A large part is related to alternative capacity. This alternative capacity represents up to 50% of the catastrophe part of the reinsurance contracting, which is good, which is very good, but I think we can increase that, okay? By catastrophic part, we mean a probability of 1 over 250 for an event. There seems to be excess capacity. I mentioned all this possibility. To explain this, I think I will start research on that. But another issue is rating. Okay, the rating agency asks more and more capital. Okay, and if you want a good rating, okay, AA plus, you must convince Standard & Poor's that you are in good shape for capital. So it has an effect. Okay, so the rating agencies become more and more powerful. They ask to the government to reduce their deficit. They ask to the insurance company to have more capital. They ask to the banks to have more capital. So the boss now seems to be the rating agencies around the world. I don't know if they are interested in climate risk, but I think they are interested in capital. So let me conclude on this. Climate risk is related to global climate change. Related, probably not causality yet. Okay? This is a major threat to global risk management around the world, okay? And particularly for the insurance industry. Okay? So what the insurer can do? I think they have to start by doing their job. Okay? So the role of an insurance company is to do underwriting, claims management, and asset management. Okay? So their participation to the economic resilience of climate risk should start by improving the insurance, I will say mainly insurance efficiency market, okay, itself, okay, to obtain better insurance access and better insurance coverage for this risk. Better understanding on climate risk, and a seminar like today and yesterday is a good way to go in that direction. Work with multidisciplinary teams to better understand the distribution of an event. Okay? I don't think insurance companies understand well the fat tail distribution for climate risk. Okay? So I think they must improve. Increase in efficiency in insurance coverage. Okay? I have a better link between investment for safety and insurance coverage. So this will increase the incentive to long-run investment in prevention for the people and for the society. Okay? Reinsurer must disclose and insure their climate risk strategy. This is about private information. Okay? Develop models of scenario. Okay? A better model for climate risk, particularly for climate risk. Stress testing for climate risk. The regulator also must improve their way to regulate, and as I said by Michel. They must take into account the public good dimension of climate risk, okay? So more coordination with public decision makers, okay? Reduce insurance risk perception, okay? So use interdisciplinary teams again to better explain what is climate risk and what we should get in the long run if we do nothing. Continue to improve the risk pooling efficiency through reinsurance and particularly the alternative instrument for climate risk. Investment in green technology sector, so the insurance company has a lot of capital, okay, so they can invest, and I think they should invest more in green technology sector to reduce the climate risk. They should also implement the mitigation technology, okay, if they can, but they are not very involved. They don't use bad technology related to fossil and things like that, but I think they can invest to improve the alternative technology. Okay? And these policies and commitment should be the business of the board. So this is the CEO and the board who should make the choice of that, okay? Not only the actuarial people and the statistical people, because to be present actively in climate risk, okay, this is part of the enterprise risk management policy of an insurance company, but they will not be able to do very much if the government does nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe we can entertain a few questions, a couple of questions. If you can. I will come to you.
Shan Wang of Geneva Association. I agree with all the three speakers in terms of what should be done. My question is what you will do, because there are some concrete steps. I think actually there's real opportunity. For example, talk about relationship between insurance, reinsurance, and government. I mean, the government will be there. They have increased role to play. But insurance, the industry does not need to insure 100%. The business model is based on efficiency, capital efficiency, return on capital. So going forward, you highlight that the major value proposition of insurance is underwriting, risk management expertise. Want to actually to suggest that perhaps, especially two professors there, given your high reputation, you could deliver some message to regulators, say through OECD or some other organizations, about the need for recognizing diversification, whether geographic diversification, also time diversification. And a second concrete thing you could do is to provide a rating of different governments, because risk concentration, if they do not transfer part of the risk to outside, that's not optimal diversification. If you do some rating of different governments, I think that's you do a really good service to the global community. I hope you will do it.
Do you have a question too, or not?
Okay. The question is whether you will do it.
Okay.
Well, let me say a word, if I may say so. You know me, I've done a lot of work in the past 5 years with the rating agency on something that's starting to emerge now. When something starts to emerge, people think it's just natural. The same thing on the cat bonds. There's a reason why cat bonds are emerging now, and the reason we spent a lot of time in the last 5 years educating investors on alternative risk transfer instruments, the education part of how it works. Very different world today than we were 5 years ago. So, there are reasons why the market develops. They develop because some people spend a lot of time and energy making sure they do. On the rating agency, we've spent a lot of time with both Moody's and S&P making the pitch was back 5 years ago that it would be great for this rating agency to start looking at municipality bonds around the world and seeing whether or not knowing the answer, whether the exposure to climate disaster should be integrated into these bonds, making the point that they should, if the exposure is very high. When we started with that idea, people thought we were crazy, that will never happen. Well, it's happening as we speak now with the S&P and Moody's both announcing they're going to do that in the US. So the point is that you can talk about doing things, or you just do them, and then you talk about them. And I think that will take all the energy this room and from many other rooms to actually doing that. The only thing I will say is that I was a big fighter of the NAIC report in the US because I think the questions were a little bit biased in the way they were asked to the insurance industry. And now the industry is depicted as doing nothing on climate with this. I think it's not true. So I just would like to just rebalance that a little bit because a lot of great initiative has been launched by both insurers and reinsurers around the world.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, what I'd like to propose is we collect a few questions. Please keep it very, very short, and then we will allow the panel to respond accordingly. So I start, if you can please take notes of questions that you feel comfortable in answering, yeah? So the gentleman on the top.
Just introduce
Please
yourself.
introduce yourself and keep it short so that we
Okay.
can get to all the questions. Thank you.
Peter Rowan here, independent consultant. Erwin, is following up your proposal for resilient bonds at the end of your presentation. Are you actually saying that this should be a plan to go forward, and are you actually going to champion it? The reason I said this is because green bonds, which have been around since around 2007, really only took off last year at $36 billion, and currently at this year I think is around 14 billion, and it seems to be stalling in that area. So if these new, you could say, innovative bonds are going to actually take hold, there seems to be that there is a need for a champion to actually push them through. And I'm saying, would you be that sort of person, or would you recommend, say, SCOR to do it, maybe?
Thank you.
We'll take a few questions.
Yeah, we take a few questions, and please make it slightly shorter, just so that there are so many hands, and I want to try to get to as many questions. Down here, I think the gentleman here, if you could, first, he's been waiting in the row, yes? If you can. Thank you, and then I will get to you. Thank you. And then
Okay, very quick. So this is about trends, and Erwin, I think you showed some trends, and George, you had some trends. And you have to be very careful about trends. So there's things you can explain. You know, there are going to be more payouts, more events, because there's more people in the United States from 1950 or 55 to today. And there are more people living on the coast and so on. Those are explainable. And then there's random processes. And this is the problem with climate, in that, you know, people say, well, gee, there's a drought in California, that must be climate change. And you know that when you have a stochastic process, if you have a geometric random walk, and you want to estimate the drift, you need hundreds of years of data to estimate the drift. And looking at patterns over 20, 30 years tells you absolutely nothing about what's going on with the drift.
great. If you can please pass to the two gentlemen here, and then we go up there, and then we will stop and allow
Yes,
the panel.
you have all insisted on the role of governments, and of course we can imagine what the role can be because of the systemic dimension of the climate change, firstly, and secondly, the role of the government in prevention, equipment, etc. At the same time, Erwan, you have been insisting on the fact that there is currently a temptation by government, probably for electoral reasons, to develop an insurance action, and perhaps at a lower cost. And my question is now, looking at the current situation of public finances around the world in advanced countries, debt and deficit, how much can government go in that direction?
Great. Can you please pass to the gentleman in front, and then the last question would be you, and we stop and we hear from the panel. Thank you.
A question for Otmar. Why don't we see in the volume 3 of the last IPCC report more information about the price of carbon and the marginal abatement cost?
Okay, and the last question, please.
I always have a question, and it's a very quick one this time, to Professor Edenhofer. I was intrigued by the simplicity of your second mitigation option by buying the fossil fuels in the ground to, prevent it from the carbon going into the atmosphere. Do you have a price for that?
Great. So thank you very much for the questions. Maybe we start with you, yeah, please.
Yeah, first the question of Christian. So there is a lot of information about the CO2 prices. It's not the social cost of carbon. It's the CO2 price, which is consistent with the budget. But you can see that the range of the prices is very large. Why? Because of the underlying assumptions of technological change. So that's the most important thing. And what we have shown so far is that the CO2 price is fundamentally driven by the availability of specific technologies, in particular carbon capture and storage. So it's a qualitative statement, but the information is there. But in your chapter, you have strongly recommended not to recommend the social costs of carbon. So it's partially your fault that we are quite silent about the social costs of carbon, not about the CO2 prices. On the compensation, I have no price on this, but I would like to highlight one important thing. If you have such a compensation scheme, there's a huge risk. And the risk is that you incentivize additional exploration activity, and this will increase to increasing resources and reserves in order to increase the price. And it seems to me this is a large risk when you try to implement such a scheme.
For the drift, I completely agree, but I didn't present any estimation of the drift. This is only descriptive statistics. So, but we cannot wait 100 years. We have to move. So I think that an approximation of the drift is better than nothing.
Just for you, Bob, just on that quickly. No, I agree. I mean, I agree. We spend a lot of time looking at that. It depends on what question you're asking, though. And I've heard that question many, many times. The question is, are you trying from the lost data to see whether there is a trend in the changing climate pattern? The answer is probably we don't have enough data to. But I think the data were showed were more to explain that for the insurance industry, that industry has been stressed a lot over the past 20 years. I mean, I think that's the main point here. In the book At War with the Weather, we decompose that, and the main drivers is nothing to do with climate. The main drivers is, to your point, we just added 2 billion people on planet Earth over the past 20 years. We're going to add another 1 billion in the next 13 years, and people are getting richer. So in the US being a clear example. So yeah, I mean, totally agree, and you can decompose that loss. On the resiliency bond, short answer is yes, I'll give it a try. It's fun. So I'm talking with BlackRock and the US Treasury now to see whether we could think about it, and I'm inviting any people who have a good idea and money to play in that space. It's not easy. It doesn't have to be a bond, by the way. You can be very innovative in the type of financial innovation we're thinking about, but the resiliency point will not wait another 40 years. And I think the point I would like to end on is maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we were debating about climate only on the mitigation side of the equation, the greenhouse gas emission reduction. Well, planet Earth has started to fight back already, and we're not doing anything about it. We're adding more people in high-risk areas. So politically, to end on your question, Philippe, the elected official, we started that discussion at the G20 in Mexico 2 years ago, and spending more time now with elected officials at the highest level saying, what do? We don't have the money to pay for that anymore. But politically, we're asked to do something. And gosh, if it's happening in the US, which again, as I mentioned, is very pro-market, mentally speaking, that will happen in many countries. France has been pretty protected of big disasters. If tomorrow we have a big earthquake in Nice and 2 or 3 big storms in France, that whole discussion will be a very, very different discussion. But again, I'm a big fan of insurance and reinsurance as one of the solutions to help enhance economic resilience. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So these rich lectures and discussion has come at a cost. And the cost is our coffee break will be very short. And we will be back here if you can please try to be here at 3:30 because we have our last round table with 5 panelists. So let's give them a chance to have a reflection. Thank you.